My teenage daughter's friend started calling me dad, and now she won't leave. My teenage daughter's friend started calling me dad, and now she won't leave, and I don't know how to handle this without destroying a broken girl. I'm a 45-year-old father of 3 kids. My oldest is my daughter Tina, who is 16, and my twin boys are 12. My wife and I have been married for 20 years, and we've built a good life together. We live in a nice house in the suburbs, and our door has always been open to our kids' friends. I grew up in a home where my parents were cold and distant, so I made a promise to myself that my house would be different. I wanted my kids to feel comfortable bringing their friends over, and I wanted those friends to feel welcome. That's probably why this whole situation got so out of control. About 8 months ago, Tina started bringing home a new friend named Jess. The first time I met her, she barely looked at me and mumbled a hello before following Tina upstairs. I didn't think much of it because a lot of teenagers are awkward around adults. But over the next few weeks, I started noticing things about Jess that concerned me. She was always hungry, like she hadn't eaten in days. Her clothes were old and didn't fit right. She flinched whenever someone raised their voice, even if it was just the boys arguing over a video game. I asked Tina about Jess's home life, and she told me that Jess's dad left when she was little, and her mom had a new boyfriend who was really mean. She said Jess hated being at home, and that's why she always wanted to come over. My wife and I talked about it and decided we would make Jess feel as welcome as possible. We started including her in family dinners and buying extra snacks we knew she liked. On weekends, we would invite her to stay over so she didn't have to go home. Looking back, I can see how we might have overdone it, but at the time, it just felt like the right thing to do. The first sign that something was shifting happened about 4 months ago. We were all eating dinner together and Jess was telling a story about something that happened at school. When she finished, she looked right at me and said, "Thanks for listening, Dad." The whole table went quiet. Tina looked confused and my wife raised her eyebrows at me. I just laughed nervously and said, "No problem, kiddo." I figured it was just a slip of the tongue and she was embarrassed, so I didn't make a big deal out of it. But then it happened again, and again. She started calling me Dad every time she came over. She would hug me when she arrived and when she left. She started asking me for advice about everything from school to friends to what clothes she should buy. She would text me directly instead of texting Tina to make plans. At first, my wife thought it was sweet that Jess had found a father figure since she never had one. But then things started getting more intense. Jess began showing up at our house without Tina. She would say Tina had invited her, but when I checked with Tina, she had no idea Jess was coming over. Jess would just sit in the living room and watch TV or do homework and wait for someone to pay attention to her. One time I came home from work and found her sitting on the porch because no one was home. She had been there for 2 hours. My wife started to get uncomfortable. She told me we needed to set some boundaries because this wasn't healthy for anyone. I agreed, but I didn't know how to do it without crushing this girl who clearly had nothing. I tried talking to Jess gently about how she needed to make plans with Tina before coming over. She started crying and asked if she had done something wrong. She asked if I didn't want her around anymore. She said I was the only adult who had ever been nice to her, and she didn't know what she would do if she couldn't come over anymore. I felt like the worst person in the world, so I backed off and told her she was always welcome. That was a mistake. 3 weeks ago, Jess told Tina that she wished I was her real dad and that Tina was lucky she didn't appreciate what she had. Tina got upset and told Jess that was a weird thing to say. They got into a fight, and Jess stormed out of our house crying. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, and Jess would stop coming around. Instead, she started showing up more. She would come over specifically when Tina wasn't home. She would find excuses to be alone with me and ask me questions about my life and my marriage. She told me I was the best dad she had ever seen and that my wife was so lucky to have me. My wife finally put her foot down and told me this had to stop immediately. She said Jess's behavior was inappropriate and that I was enabling it by being too nice. She said I needed to have a serious conversation with Jess and make it clear that I was not her father and she needed to respect our family's boundaries. I waited until the house was quiet that night before I went looking for my wife. The boys had finally stopped arguing about their video game and gone to bed. Tina was in her room with the door closed and her music playing softly. My wife was sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through her phone when I pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. She looked up at me, and I could see the worry in her eyes. I told her she was right about everything and that I needed to talk to Jess tomorrow. We spent the next hour planning exactly what I would say. My wife grabbed a notebook, and we wrote down the boundaries we needed to set. No more showing up without texting first. No more coming over when Tina wasn't home. No more calling me dad. As I wrote the words, my hand started shaking because I knew this conversation was going to hurt Jess badly. My wife reached across the table and squeezed my other hand. She reminded me that letting this continue would hurt Jess even more in the long run. I knew she was right, but that didn't make it any easier. The next afternoon, I was sitting in the living room trying to focus on work emails when I heard the front door open. Jess walked in without knocking like she always did. Tina was at soccer practice, so I knew Jess had come specifically when my daughter wouldn't be home. I stood up and asked Jess to sit down on the couch. She looked at me confused and started walking toward the kitchen instead. I said her name again and pointed at the couch. She froze in the doorway and her whole body went stiff. She turned around slowly, and I could see her eyes were already filling up with tears. She sat down on the edge of the couch and stared at her hands. She asked me what was wrong, and her voice was so small I almost couldn't hear her. I sat down in the chair across from her instead of next to her like I normally would have. I told Jess as gently as I could that we needed to talk about some things. I explained that she couldn't keep calling me dad because I wasn't her father, and it was confusing for everyone. I said she needed to coordinate her visits with Tina instead of just showing up whenever she wanted. I told her she couldn't come over when Tina wasn't home anymore. Jess started crying before I finished the first sentence. She kept asking what she did wrong over and over. She said I was the only adult who had ever been nice to her, and now I was kicking her out. I tried to explain that I wasn't kicking her out, but she wasn't listening anymore. She was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. She told me she had nowhere else to go and that her mom's boyfriend hated her. She said coming to our house was the only thing that made her life okay. I felt like I was drowning watching her fall apart. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to take it all back and tell her everything was fine. But I thought about my wife's face last night and I forced myself to keep going. I told Jess these boundaries were important for everyone, including her. Jess stood up suddenly and ran for the door. I called after her, but she was already gone. I heard her footsteps on the porch and then nothing. I sat there staring at the door she'd left open and felt sick. I pulled out my phone and texted my wife that I'd done it. She texted back asking how it went, and I didn't know what to say. I just wrote that Jess ran out crying. My wife came home an hour later and found me still sitting in the same spot. She sat down next to me and put her hand on my knee. She told me I did the right thing, but I couldn't stop thinking about the look on Jess's face. That evening, Tina came home from practice and immediately asked where Jess was. I told her we'd had a conversation about boundaries, and Jess got upset. Tina pulled out her phone and showed me that Jess wasn't answering any of her texts. My daughter looked worried and asked what I said to her. I explained the boundaries we'd set, and Tina nodded slowly. She said she understood, but she was clearly stressed about her friend. I spent the whole evening feeling like I'd kicked a puppy. 2 days went by with no word from Jess. Tina was worried sick and kept checking her phone every few minutes. I called the school office and asked if Jess had been attending classes. The secretary put me on hold and then came back to confirm that Jess had been there both days, but one of her teachers mentioned she looked upset. I thanked her and hung up. That evening at dinner, the twins asked why Jess hadn't been over lately. They said they missed her being around. I looked at my wife, and she looked back at me with this expression that said she knew what I was thinking. Jess had become such a regular part of our family routine that even the boys noticed when she was gone. I told them Jess was busy with school stuff and we'd see her soon. They seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to arguing about who got the last piece of garlic bread. On the third morning, I was making coffee when someone knocked on the door. I looked at the clock and saw it was only 7 in the morning. I opened the door and found Jess standing on the porch in her school uniform. Her eyes were red and puffy like she'd been crying all night. She started apologizing immediately for running out and for making things weird. She promised she would respect all the boundaries I'd set. Then she asked if she could still come over sometimes because she had nowhere else to go. The way she said it made my chest hurt. She looked so desperate and broken that I almost told her to forget everything I'd said. I could feel myself starting to cave. I took a deep breath and told Jess she was welcome to visit with Tina, but she needed to text first before coming over. I said she couldn't come over when Tina wasn't home anymore. Jess nodded her head so fast I thought she might hurt her neck. She said okay over and over like she was afraid I'd change my mind. I could see in her eyes that she was just telling me what I wanted to hear. She would agree to anything right now to keep access to our house. I glanced toward the kitchen and saw my wife standing there with her arms crossed, watching the whole thing. Her face told me she was thinking the same thing I was. This wasn't going to work. Jess thanked me and said she had to get to the school. She practically ran off the porch. My wife came over and stood next to me in the doorway. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. The next week was strange. Jess did text before coming over like I'd asked. But the texts were constant. She would text me in the morning asking if she could come over after school. Then she'd text again at lunch asking if I thought she should join the debate club. Then she'd text asking what she should eat for lunch. Then she'd ask if she could stay for dinner. Then she'd ask if I thought she should do her homework before or after watching TV. Every single decision in her life suddenly required my permission or approval. She'd stopped calling me dad, but now she was treating me like I was responsible for managing every aspect of her existence. My phone buzzed constantly with her messages. My wife would look at me every time it happened and raise her eyebrows. I started to realize that the boundary conversation hadn't fixed the attachment problem at all. It had just changed how the problem showed up. Tina pulled me aside one evening after Jess had finally gone home. My daughter looked frustrated and tired. She told me Jess was being weird at the school too. She was following Tina between classes and getting upset when Tina sat with other friends at lunch. Jess would text her during class asking where she was and who she was with. Tina said she felt like she couldn't breathe without Jess needing to know about it. I asked if she'd tried talking to Jess about it, and Tina said yes, but Jess just cried and apologized, and then did the same things the next day. I sat down on the stairs and put my head in my hands. I realized I was completely in over my head with this situation. I had no idea how to help Jess, and everything I tried seemed to make things worse. My wife found me sitting there and sat down next to me. She said we needed professional help to understand what was happening with Jess. She pulled out her phone and said she was going to call the school counselor to set up a meeting. I felt relieved that someone with actual training might have answers. My wife called the next morning and scheduled an appointment with Randolph Stevenson for the following week. She told him we needed to discuss a student without that student being present. He said he understood and would make time for us. I spent the rest of the week feeling like I was waiting for someone to tell me how to fix the mess I'd created. The appointment with Randolph was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon. My wife and I drove to the high school together in silence. I kept thinking about all the times Jess had shown up at our house and how I'd just let it happen without questioning whether I was actually helping her. We signed in at the front office and waited in the hallway outside the counseling center. The walls were covered with posters about college applications and mental health resources. I wondered if Jess had ever stopped to read any of them, or if she'd been too focused on getting to our house to notice. Randolph opened his door exactly on time and invited us in. His office was small but comfortable with 2 chairs facing his desk. He had a calm way about him that made me feel like maybe he could actually help us figure this out. My wife sat down first, and I took the chair next to her. Randolph asked us to tell him everything from the beginning, so I started with the first time Jess called me dad at dinner. I explained how it escalated from there, how she started showing up was uninvited, how she treated me like I was responsible for every decision in her life. My wife added details about Jess following Tina at the school and the constant text messages. Randolph took notes and asked questions about Jess's home life and what we knew about her mother and the boyfriend. When we finished talking, he put down his pen and looked at both of us. He said what we were describing sounded like reactive attachment disorder, which happens when kids grow up in neglectful or abusive environments. They don't learn how to form healthy attachments to caregivers, so they either avoid getting close to anyone or they latch onto people in unhealthy ways. He explained that my family had become a substitute for everything Jess was missing at home, but that I'd accidentally made things worse by encouraging her dependence instead of helping her build a broader support system. His words hit me hard because I'd been so focused on being the dad I never had that I didn't realize I was creating a different kind of problem. Randolph said the constant need for approval and the inability to function without checking in with me were signs that Jess didn't have healthy coping skills. She'd learned that adults either ignored her or hurt her, so when she found an adult who was kind, she didn't know how to maintain appropriate boundaries. My wife asked what we should do now, and Randolph said we needed to maintain firm boundaries while he worked with Jess at the school on developing better strategies for managing her emotions and building healthier relationships. He said he'd schedule regular sessions with Jess to help her understand attachment patterns and teach her skills for forming connections that weren't so intense and one-sided. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. He asked if we'd considered whether Jess's home situation needed to be reported to Child Protective Services. I felt my face get hot because the thought had crossed my mind, but I'd pushed it away. Randolph said that based on what we were describing, Jess might be in actual danger at home, not just dealing with an unpleasant situation. He said neglect was a form of abuse, and if her mother was leaving her alone with a violent boyfriend, that constituted an unsafe environment. The conversation had shifted from managing Jess's behavior to recognizing that she might need intervention beyond what our family or school counseling could provide. My wife reached over and squeezed my hand. Randolph said he wasn't telling us what to do, but that we should seriously consider making a report because CPS had resources and legal authority to investigate and provide support that we didn't have. He said sometimes the most helpful thing you can do for a kid is connect them with proper systems instead of trying to rescue them yourself. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Randolph had said. After the kids went to bed, I told my wife I wanted to drive past Jess's house to see where she actually lived. She asked if that was a good idea, but I said I needed to see it for myself. I'd been playing substitute dad for months without ever checking on her actual living conditions. I got in my car and drove to the address Tina had given me once when Jess forgot something at our house. It was only 3 blocks away, but in a different neighborhood where the houses were smaller and closer together. When I pulled up in front of Jess's house, my chest got tight. The yard was completely overgrown with weeds as tall as my knees. There was a broken window on the first floor covered with cardboard and duct tape. The paint was peeling off the siding, and the front porch sagged in the middle like it might collapse. I could hear yelling coming from inside, a man's voice and then a woman's voice screaming back. I sat in my car with the engine off, feeling ashamed that I'd never thought to come here before. I'd been so busy making Jess feel welcome at my house that I never considered what she was going home to every night. The arguing inside got louder, and I heard something crash. I wanted to knock on the door, but I didn't know what I would say or if it would make things worse for Jess. I started my car and drove home slowly, trying to process what I'd seen. The next day, I went back to Jess's neighborhood, but this time, I walked around the block. I saw a woman watering her garden 2 houses down from Jess's place. I recognized her from community events at the park. I walked over and said hello. She remembered me, and we talked about the weather for a minute before I mentioned that my daughter was friends with a girl who lived nearby. I asked if she knew anything about the family in the house with the broken window. Her face changed, and she looked uncomfortable. She said everyone on the street knew about that house. She told me Jess's mom was rarely home, and when she was, her boyfriend was usually drunk and aggressive. She said they'd called the police twice in the past year for domestic disturbances because the yelling got so loud. Another neighbor came out to check his mail and joined our conversation. He said he'd seen Jess leaving for school in the morning wearing the same clothes multiple days in a row. He said once he'd tried to talk to the boyfriend about keeping the yard maintained, and the guy had threatened him. I thanked them both and walked back to my car feeling sick. Everything Jess had told Tina about her home life was true. She wasn't being dramatic or exaggerating. She was living in an actually dangerous situation, and I'd been treating it like she just needed a nice place to hang out. When I got home, my wife was making dinner. I told her what I'd seen and what the neighbors had said. She stopped chopping vegetables and leaned against the counter. We spent the rest of the evening after the kids were in bed debating whether to call Child Protective Services. My wife was worried that reporting Jess's situation might make things worse. She said, "What if CPS investigated and didn't find enough evidence to do anything, but then Jess's mom and Victor found out we were the ones who called?" She said Victor might take it out on Jess or kick her out completely. I understood her concerns because I had the same fears. But Randolph's words kept echoing in my head about how real help requires proper systems, not just our family trying to rescue her ourselves. We talked in circles for hours. My wife said maybe we should wait and see if the school counseling helped first. I said, what if something happened to Jess while we were waiting? She said, what if our report triggered something worse? I said, what if doing nothing meant Jess stayed in danger? Finally, around midnight, my wife said she thought we should make the call, but that we needed to be prepared for Jess to be angry with us. She said this might end our relationship with her completely, but that her safety was more important than whether she liked us. I agreed, even though my stomach was in knots thinking about Jess feeling betrayed. I made the call to CPS first thing the next morning before I could change my mind. The woman who answered transferred me to someone named Georgiana Stevenson, who handled intake reports. I told her everything I'd observed about Jess over the past 8 months. I described the constant hunger, the old clothes, the flinching at raised voices. I told her about driving past the house and seeing the conditions. I repeated what the neighbors had said about the domestic disturbances and the drunk boyfriend. Georgiana took detailed notes and asked specific questions about how often Jess came to our house and what she'd said about her mother and Victor. She asked if I'd ever seen physical injuries on Jess. I said no, but that Jess always wore long sleeves even in warm weather. Georgiana said they would open an investigation and conduct a home visit within the next few days. She warned me that the process would take time and that I should prepare for Jess to be angry when she found out someone had reported her family. She said kids in these situations often feel protective of their parents, even when the parents are failing them. She told me I'd done the right thing by calling, but that I needed to understand this might get worse before it got better. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table feeling like I'd just betrayed Jess, even though I knew reporting was necessary. My wife came downstairs and hugged me. She said we'd done what we had to do, and now we had to trust the system to help Jess properly. 2 days later, Georgiana showed up at our house in the early evening. She said she wanted to interview my wife and me in person as part of the investigation. We sat in the living room and she asked us to go through everything again in more detail. She wanted to know exactly when Jess started calling me Dad and how we'd responded. She asked why we'd let the situation go on for so long without seeking help. She asked if our involvement might have prevented Jess from reaching out to proper authorities sooner because she had our family as an escape. I didn't have good answers to those questions. I tried to explain that I was just trying to be nice to a kid who clearly needed help, but Georgiana's questions made me realize that my enabling might have actually delayed intervention. She asked if we'd ever offered to help Jess contact social services or talk to a school counselor before now. I admitted we hadn't. She asked if we'd ever documented any of our concerns or tried to verify what Jess was telling us about her home life. I said no. My wife started crying and said we'd made mistakes, but that we genuinely cared about Jess and wanted her to be safe. Georgiana's expression softened a bit. She said she understood we'd been trying to help, but that situations like this required professional intervention, not just kind neighbors. She said she would be visiting Jess at the school the next day and conducting a home inspection. She told us not to contact Jess or warn her family about the investigation. Before she left, she said the process would likely be difficult for everyone involved, but that it was necessary to ensure Jess's safety. Jess found out about the CPS report when Georgiana visited her at the school during third period. My phone started buzzing in my pocket around 10:30 in the morning. I was at work in a meeting, but I felt the vibrations and knew something was wrong. When the meeting ended, I checked my phone and saw 12 text messages from Jess. The first one said she couldn't believe I'd done this to her. The second one said I'd ruined everything. The third one said she'd trusted me and I'd destroyed her life. The messages got more frantic from there. She said her mom was furious and Victor was threatening to kick her out. She said everyone at the school was going to find out and she'd never be able to show her face again. She said she wished she'd never met me. The last message said I was just like every other adult who'd pretended to care and then made everything worse. My stomach dropped reading her panic and anger. I wanted to text back and explain that I was trying to help her, but Georgiana had told me not to contact her. I showed the messages to my wife, who said we needed to let the process play out, even though it was hard. I spent the rest of the day at work, unable to focus, checking my phone every few minutes to see if Jess had sent more messages. Randolph called me that afternoon around 3. He said Jess had come to his office after Georgiana left and had a complete breakdown. She'd been crying so hard she couldn't breathe and saying that everyone had betrayed her. He said he'd tried to explain that the CPS report was meant to help her, but she wasn't in a state to hear it. He'd eventually had to call her mother to come pick her up early because Jess couldn't calm down enough to go back to class. Randolph said this was part of the process and that Jess's anger was actually a sign she'd felt safe with my family, which meant she could learn to feel safe with proper support systems too. He said her reaction showed how much she'd been depending on us emotionally, and that breaking that unhealthy dependence was necessary, even though it was painful. His words made sense, but they didn't make me feel any better. I asked if he thought Jess would be okay, and he said it would take time, but yes, with proper support, she would be better off than she was before. He reminded me that I'd done the right thing even though it didn't feel that way right now. That evening, Tina came downstairs looking upset. She said half the school knew about the CPS investigation because Jess had told her friends and word had spread. She said Jess wouldn't answer any of her texts or calls. Tina was angry with me for making this decision without preparing her for how it would affect things at the school. She said people were asking her questions about Jess's home life and whether our family was trying to get Jess taken away. She said some kids were saying I was a creep for letting Jess call me dad. Other kids were saying Jess was lying about everything for attention. Tina said her friendship with Jess was probably over, and everyone at the school thought our family was either heroes or villains, depending on who you asked. I tried to explain that I'd had to report the situation because Jess might be in danger, but Tina cut me off. She said I should have warned her first, so she could have been prepared. She said I was, so focused on doing the right thing that I didn't think about how it would blow up her entire social life. She went back upstairs and slammed her door. My wife looked at me and said we'd get through this, but I wasn't so sure. The next morning, my wife asked Tina to come downstairs so we could all talk. Tina dragged herself to the kitchen table looking like she hadn't slept much either. My wife sat between us and explained that we needed to have an honest conversation about everything that had happened with Jess. I started by apologizing to Tina for not including her in the decision to call CPS. I told her I should have warned her about what was coming and prepared her for how it might affect things at the school. Tina's eyes filled with tears, and she said she'd known for months that Jess's situation at home was really bad, but didn't know what to do about it. She said Jess had told her things about Victor being mean and her mom leaving her alone for days, but made her promise not to tell any adults. Tina felt guilty for keeping the secret, but also scared that telling would make everything worse for Jess. My wife reached over and squeezed Tina's hand. We all sat there crying together and admitting we could have handled this better from the start. Tina said she understood now why I had to make the report, but she was still mad that everyone at the school was talking about it. I promised I would try to do better about including her in big decisions that affected her life. The conversation didn't fix everything, but it felt like we were at least being honest with each other for the first time in weeks. 7 days went by with no word from Jess, and I checked my phone constantly hoping for some sign she was okay. Every time I drove past her street, I slowed down looking for any indication of what was happening inside that house. The not knowing was eating me alive, and I kept imagining worst-case scenarios. On the 8th day, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Georgiana's voice came through calm and professional. She said she'd completed the home investigation and needed to update me on what she'd found. My hands started shaking as I pulled over to the side of the road so I could focus on what she was saying. Georgiana explained that the investigation had uncovered clear evidence of neglect and an unsafe living environment. Victor had a criminal record that included 2 prior assault charges from different relationships. Laura had admitted during the interview that she frequently left Jess alone overnight and sometimes for multiple days when she stayed with Victor at his apartment. The house had broken appliances, no working heat in Jess's bedroom, and almost no food in the refrigerator. Georgiana said based on these findings, CPS was opening a formal case and would be monitoring the family closely. I asked if Jess was going to be taken away, and Georgiana said they were working on a safety plan that would allow her to stay in the home with supervision and support services. Relief and worry mixed together in my chest because I was glad Jess wouldn't be removed, but terrified about her staying in that environment. Georgiana spent another 20 minutes on the phone explaining what would happen next. She said Jess would be assigned a dedicated caseworker who would check in regularly and make sure the safety plan was followed. Laura would be required to attend parenting classes and substance abuse counseling. Victor would not be allowed to stay overnight at the house or have unsupervised contact with Jess. Jess herself would be required to attend therapy sessions twice a week to work on her attachment issues and coping strategies. Georgiana explained that removing kids from their homes often causes more trauma than keeping them there with proper support systems in place. She said this approach addressed the root problems while keeping Jess in familiar surroundings near her school and friends. I wanted to argue that the house wasn't safe and Jess should come stay with us, but I knew that wasn't how the system worked. Georgiana must have heard the doubt in my silence because she reminded me that my family couldn't be Jess's only support network. She said the goal was to build multiple layers of professional help, so Jess had resources beyond one family trying to rescue her. The logic made sense, but my gut still twisted with worry about Jess sleeping in that cold bedroom with a broken window. 3 days after Georgiana's call, My phone rang again, and this time it was Randolph. He said Jess had come back to the school that morning after being absent for over a week. She'd stopped by his office during lunch, looking tired but a little less panicked than when everything first exploded. Randolph was meeting with her twice a week now as part of the CPS safety plan. He said the initial shock was wearing off, and Jess was starting to understand that the intervention might actually help her situation instead of making it worse. She'd told him that Victor had moved out, which meant the house felt safer, even though it was still a mess. Her mom was being nicer to her and actually asking about her day at the school. Small improvements, but improvements nonetheless. Randolph suggested I give Jess more time before trying to reach out because she was still processing a lot of complicated feelings about my family and the report. He said she needed space to work through her anger and confusion with her therapist before she'd be ready to hear from me directly. I agreed, even though waiting felt impossible. I asked Randolph to let Jess know I was thinking about her and hoping she was okay. He said he would pass along the message when the timing felt right. My wife suggested we start seeing a therapist to work through the stress this whole situation had created in our marriage. She'd already researched someone named Ingrid Kirk, who specialized in family dynamics and boundary issues. I agreed immediately because the tension between us had gotten bad over the past few weeks. We had our first appointment on a Thursday evening in a small office that smelled like lavender. Ingrid was probably in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes that made me feel like she'd heard every possible family problem before. She asked us to each describe what had been happening and how it was affecting our relationship. My wife talked about feeling ignored and undermined when I kept backing down on boundaries with Jess. I talked about feeling torn between wanting to help a kid in need and respecting my wife's concerns about the situation becoming unhealthy. Ingrid listened carefully and then started asking questions about my childhood and my parents. She helped me see how growing up with cold, distant parents had driven me to overcompensate by trying to be everything to everyone. She said my fear of being like my parents had actually created a different kind of problem where I couldn't enforce healthy limits. My wife started crying when Ingrid explained this because she said it was exactly what she'd been trying to tell me for months, but couldn't find the right words. Ingrid gave us some tools for communicating better about boundaries and making parenting decisions as a team instead of me acting alone out of guilt and fear. The session lasted almost 2 hours, and we left feeling exhausted, but hopeful that we could repair the damage. 21 days after I'd made the CPS report, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My heart jumped, thinking it might be Jess, but when I opened it, the message was short and careful. It said she was sorry for the angry messages she'd sent right after finding out about the report. She said she understood now that I was trying to help, even though it didn't feel that way at first. She wasn't ready to talk yet, but wanted me to know she didn't hate me. I read the message 3 times, trying to decode every word for hidden meaning. I showed it to my wife, who smiled for the first time in days. She said this was progress, and we should respect Jess's need for space while being grateful she'd reached out at all. I typed and deleted about 5 different responses before finally sending back a simple message, saying I was glad she was okay, and I'd be here whenever she was ready to talk. The small weight that lifted off my chest felt enormous. I hadn't realized how much Jess's anger and silence had been crushing me until I felt a tiny bit of relief. That weekend, Tina came home from a school event and mentioned that Jess had been sitting with a different group of friends at lunch all week. I asked how Jess seemed, and Tina said she looked okay, maybe a little quieter than usual, but not falling apart. Tina admitted they'd texted a few times but were taking a break from hanging out outside school. I could hear the sadness in Tina's voice about losing her friend, but also something that sounded like relief at having less intensity in the friendship. She said one of Jess's new friends were a girl named Maya, who was really nice and seemed to have her life together. Tina thought maybe being around different people would be good for Jess, instead of depending so much on our family. I agreed and felt proud of Tina for being mature enough to recognize that some distance was healthy, even though it hurt. My wife made Tina's favorite dinner that night, and we all sat around the table talking about normal things like homework and the twins' upcoming soccer game. The ordinary conversation felt like a gift after weeks of crisis and tension. 2 weeks later, Georgiana called with an update that made me actually feel hopeful for the first time. She said Laura had completed her parenting assessment, and the results showed she was capable of being a better parent with proper support. Laura had started attending support groups for substance abuse and was 3 weeks sober. Victor had officially moved out after CPS gave Laura an ultimatum that he couldn't be around Jess anymore. The house still needed repairs, but Laura was working with a community organization that helped low-income families fix safety issues. Most importantly, Jess was attending therapy regularly, and her therapist reported she was making real progress on understanding her attachment issues. Georgiana said Jess was learning to identify when she was seeking validation from others instead of building her own sense of worth. The therapist was teaching her coping strategies for when she felt abandoned or unwanted. Georgiana's voice held genuine optimism when she said this was the first case in months where she'd seen such quick, positive movement. I thanked her for everything she was doing and hung up, feeling like maybe I hadn't completely destroyed Jess's life by making that report. A few days after Georgiana's call, I got an email from someone named Holden Garrison, who introduced himself as Jess's case coordinator through youth services. He explained that his job was to connect Jess with resources and support beyond just the CPS monitoring. He was setting up a mentor match program where Jess would be paired with a college student who could meet with her weekly. He'd also enrolled her in an after-school program that provided homework help and life skills training. The program included resources for college prep, which Holden said was important because Jess had the grades to go to a good school if she had proper guidance. Holden thanked me in the email for making the initial report and said early intervention had made a huge difference in what services they could provide. He said too often kids like Jess fell through the cracks because no one wanted to get involved or report concerns. My quick action had given them the chance to build a real support network before Jess's situation got even worse. Reading his words made me feel less guilty about the chaos the report had caused. Maybe I'd actually done something right, even though the process had been painful for everyone involved. 32 days after I'd sat in my car and called CPS, Tina came to me and said Jess had asked if she could come over to talk to me and my wife together. My stomach dropped, and I immediately started worrying about what Jess wanted to say. Tina said Jess seemed calm when she asked, not angry or upset, just serious. My wife and I agreed and set up a time for Saturday afternoon. I spent the days leading up to the meeting feeling nervous and rehearsing different things I might need to say. When Saturday came, I kept looking out the window waiting for Jess to arrive. She walked up to our door at exactly 2 o'clock, looking different from I'd ever seen her. She seemed healthier somehow with color in her cheeks and her hair pulled back neatly. Her clothes were clean and actually fit properly, but the biggest change was in how she carried herself. She stood up straighter and looked me directly in the eye when I opened the door. She didn't immediately hug me or call me Dad. She just said hi and asked if we could all sit down and talk. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. My wife came into the living room and we all took seats with Jess in the armchair across from us on the couch. The air felt heavy with anticipation, but not the desperate neediness that used to fill our house when Jess visited. This felt different, more grounded and real. Jess took a breath and started talking in a steady voice that sounded different from how she used to sound when she visited our house. She said she wanted to apologize for making everything so weird and uncomfortable over the past months. She looked at me and then at my wife and explained that her therapist had been helping her understand what she was really doing when she kept coming over and calling me Dad. She said she was trying to build a fantasy family in her head instead of dealing with the actual problems in her real life. Her therapist showed her that running away to our house every day wasn't fixing anything. It was just letting her pretend her situation didn't exist. Jess said the CPS report was scary at first, and she was really mad about it. But now she understood it was the best thing that could have happened. She was actually getting real help instead of just hiding at our house and pretending everything was fine. My wife reached over and squeezed my hand while Jess was talking. I felt some of the tension I'd been carrying for weeks start to ease up a little. Jess looked healthier than I'd seen her in months, like she was actually sleeping and eating regular meals. She thanked us for caring about her, but said she knew now that what she really needed was professional support, not just a nice family to visit. I cleared my throat and told Jess I needed to apologize too. I explained that I should have set better boundaries from the very beginning, instead of letting her become so dependent on our family. I said I was trying to be helpful and kind, but I actually made her problems worse by giving her an escape instead of helping her find a real solution. Looking back, I could see how I let things get out of control because I was scared of hurting her feelings or making her feel was rejected. But that wasn't actually helping her. It was just making it easier for her to avoid dealing with her home situation. Jess nodded and said she understood that now. She told me her therapist explained that I was trying to be nice, but that sometimes being nice in the wrong way can actually cause more harm than good. She said giving her an escape route just delayed her getting the real help she needed. The conversation felt hard and uncomfortable, but also more honest than any of our previous interactions had ever been. We weren't pretending anymore or walking on eggshells. We were just being real with each other about what had happened and what needed to change. After we finished talking in the living room, Tina came downstairs and asked if she and Jess could go up to her room to talk privately. My wife and I agreed, and the two girls disappeared upstairs. I could hear their voices through the ceiling, but couldn't make out what they were saying. They stayed up there for over an hour, while my wife and I sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and not saying much. We were both processing everything that had just happened. When Jess finally came back downstairs, she looked like she'd been crying, but in a good way, like she'd gotten something important off her chest. She hugged both of us goodbye without calling me Dad or hanging on too long. After she left, Tina came into the kitchen and sat down at the table. She told us that she and Jess had a really good talk about their friendship and what it needed to look like going forward. They agreed to rebuild things slowly with healthier boundaries. They were going to hang out at the school and do group activities with other friends, but take a break from the constant sleepovers and the intense one-on-one time. Tina said they both needed some space to figure out who they were as individuals instead of being so wrapped up in each other. She seemed relieved to have her friend back, but without all the pressure and weirdness that had built up. I was proud of how mature she was being about the whole situation. The following week, my wife and I had our regular therapy session with Ingrid. We told her about Jess coming over and the conversation we'd had. Ingrid said it sounded like a real breakthrough for everyone involved. Then she shifted the focus to my wife and me, and how this whole experience had affected our marriage. My wife admitted that she'd felt really ignored and undermined during the months when I kept backing down on boundaries with Jess. She said every time she tried to bring up concerns, I would make excuses or find reasons why we needed to give Jess more chances. It made her feel like I wasn't listening to her or respecting her judgment about what was healthy for our family. I sat there listening and feeling ashamed because she was right. I had been so focused on not wanting to be like my cold, distant parents that I swung way too far in the opposite direction. I was so desperate to be the warm, welcoming father figure that I completely ignored the warning signs that what I was doing wasn't actually helping anyone. Ingrid helped us talk through how my childhood trauma had influenced my parenting choices in ways I hadn't fully understood. She pointed out that I could be warm and caring without erasing all boundaries. The two things weren't opposite. They could exist together. My wife and I committed to making decisions together as a team going forward instead of me just doing what I thought was right without consulting her properly. That evening after dinner, the twins asked me why Jess hadn't been coming over anymore. They'd noticed she was gone and wanted to know if something bad had happened. My wife and I sat down with them in the living room and had a conversation that was appropriate for their age. We explained that sometimes when people are going through hard times, they need professional help from counselors and social workers, not just nice families being kind to them. We told them that trying to fix big problems by ourselves without proper training can actually make things worse even when we have good intentions. The twins seemed to understand what we were saying. One of them asked if Jess was okay now, and I told him she was getting the help she needed and doing much better. The other twin asked if we did something wrong by being nice to her. I explained that being nice wasn't wrong, but that we should have connected her with professional support much sooner instead of trying to be everything she needed. It felt important to teach them this lesson, even though I'd learned it the hard way. They needed to know that helping people is good, but there are limits to what regular people can do, and when you need to involve experts. 6 weeks passed after that first boundary conversation I'd had with Jess. During that time, she came over a few times, but always with Tina, and always as part of a group of friends. The visits felt completely different from before. One Saturday evening, Jess came over for a family dinner for the first time since everything had happened. When she walked through the door, the atmosphere felt lighter somehow. The desperate neediness that used to follow her into our house was gone. She sat at the dinner table and laughed at the twins' stupid jokes about their video games. She told us about her after-school program and how she was learning photography. She talked about a project she was working on for English class. The whole time, she was just being a normal teenager having dinner with her friend's family. She wasn't constantly looking at me for approval or trying to insert herself into every conversation. She didn't call me dad or act like she belonged to our family. She was just Jess, Tina's friend, having a nice evening. It felt like having a normal teenage guest in our home instead of managing a crisis. My wife caught my eye across the table and smiled. We both felt the difference. A few days later, I got a phone call from Laura, Jess's mom. She asked if my wife and I would be willing to meet her for coffee. Her voice sounded nervous, but sincere. My wife and I talked about it and agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near our house. When we walked in, Laura was already sitting at a corner table looking uncomfortable. The meeting was awkward at first, with lots of silence and people not knowing what to say. But then Laura started talking and thanked us for making the CPS report. She said she knew we must have been scared to do it and worried about making things worse. She admitted she'd been in complete denial about how bad things had gotten at home. She'd been so focused on keeping Victor happy and managing her own problems that she hadn't seen how much Jess was suffering. Laura told us she'd been sober for 5 weeks and was working with a counselor on her own trauma and parenting skills. Victor was out of the picture permanently, and she was learning how to be the mother Jess deserved. Seeing her take real responsibility for what had happened gave me hope that Jess's home situation might actually improve for the long term. Laura wasn't making excuses or blaming other people. She was owning her mistakes and doing the work to fix them. The next week, I got a call from Randolph at the school. He wanted to update me on how Jess was doing. He said she was absolutely thriving with her new support system in place. She'd joined the debate team and was talking about college for the first time in her life. Her grades had improved, and she was participating more in class. Randolph explained that having multiple adults in appropriate roles, rather than one family trying to be everything for her, had helped Jess develop much healthier relationship patterns. She had her therapist for emotional support, her caseworker for practical help, her mentor for guidance, and her teachers for academic encouragement. She also had friends her own age and was rebuilding her relationship with her mother. All of these connections together were giving her what she needed in a way that was sustainable and healthy. Randolph said he wanted me to know that calling CPS had been absolutely the right choice, even though it was terrifying at the time. I hung up the phone feeling validated and relieved. The decision that had felt so scary and uncertain had turned out to be exactly what Jess needed. My wife and I went back to therapy with Ingrid and had what felt like our best session yet. We talked about rebuilding the trust and closeness in our marriage that had gotten damaged during the whole situation with Jess. Ingrid pointed out that we were communicating more honestly with each other now than we probably had in years. The crisis had forced us to confront issues in our relationship that we'd been avoiding or sweeping under the rug. Things like how we made decisions together, how we handled disagreements, and how we supported each other when we had different opinions about parenting. We'd been coasting along for a while, assuming everything was fine because we weren't fighting. But the Jess situation revealed that we had some real problems with communication and teamwork that needed to be addressed. Ingrid said that in a strange way, we were actually closer now than we'd been before everything happened. We'd done the hard work of being honest with each other and fixing the cracks in our foundation. My wife reached over and held my hand during the session. I felt grateful that we'd pushed through the difficult conversations instead of letting resentment build up. That weekend, Tina came and found me in the garage where I was organizing some tools. She sat down on an old stool and told me she wanted to say something. She said she was proud of me for doing the hard thing with Jess, even though it was really scary and I didn't know how it would turn out. She explained that watching me admit my mistakes and work to fix them had taught her more about being an adult than any lecture or advice I could have given her. She said a lot of parents just pretend they're always right and never apologize when they mess up. But I had shown her that real adults own their mistakes and do the work to make things better. Her words meant everything to me. I'd been so worried that this whole situation had damaged my relationship with my daughter or made her lose respect for me. But instead, she'd learned something valuable by watching me struggle through it and come out the other side. I realized that this whole painful experience might have actually strengthened my relationship with Tina in ways I never expected. She saw me as a real person who makes mistakes and tries to fix them, not just as a parent who pretends to have all the answers. 2 months passed, and our family found its way into something that felt normal but different. Jess still came over, but she texted Tina first and showed up when Tina was actually home. She hugged me when she arrived and when she left, but she called me Mister. Now instead of Dad. The first time she did it, I felt a small pang of something like loss, but then I realized the shift was exactly what needed to happen. She was treating me like her friend's father, instead of trying to make me into something I wasn't. The visits happened maybe twice a week instead of every day, and she brought her homework or watched movies with Tina instead of seeking me out for constant validation. My wife noticed the change immediately, and I could see her shoulders relax when Jess was around. The tension that had filled our house for months started to fade, and dinner time felt like family time again, instead of a performance for an audience. Holden called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was driving home from work. He told me Jess had been matched with a mentor through the youth services program, and the relationship was going really well. The mentor was a woman in her 30s named Sarah, who had grown up in foster care and now worked as a middle school teacher. Holden said Sarah understood what Jess was going through because she had lived it herself. Jess met with Sarah twice a week, and they did normal things like getting coffee or going to the library or just talking about life. Holden said Jess was learning to form a healthy attachment with someone who actually had training in providing guidance to teenagers with trauma backgrounds. I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me as I pulled into my driveway. The weight of trying to be everything Jess needed had been crushing me, even though I didn't fully realize it until that moment. Knowing she had proper support from someone qualified to help her made me feel like I could finally breathe. A few weeks later, Georgiana called with an update about Laura. She told me Laura had been sober for almost 3 months and had gotten a new job at a grocery store with steady daytime hours. The boyfriend, Victor, was completely out of the picture, and Laura had been attending parenting classes and substance abuse support groups. Georgiana said the home environment had improved, so much that CPS was moving from active intervention to just monitoring the situation. Jess was actually spending more time at home now and had told her caseworker she felt safer there than she had in years. Georgiana explained that the whole system working together was giving Jess the stability she needed in ways that one family trying to rescue her never could have. I hung up the phone and told my wife the news. She smiled and said this was exactly what she had hoped would happen when we first called CPS. The fear and guilt I had been carrying about making that report started to ease a little bit. One Saturday afternoon, Jess knocked on our door and asked if she could talk to me and my wife together. We sat down in the living room, and she asked if she could babysit the twins occasionally to earn some extra money. My wife and I looked at each other, and I could see her doing the mental calculation of whether this was appropriate or another boundary issue waiting to happen. We told Jess we needed to think about it and talk it over. After she left, we spent an hour discussing whether having Jess babysit would blur the lines we had worked so hard to establish. We decided to try it with very clear expectations about her role and responsibilities. The first time she came over to watch the twins, I was nervous the whole time we were out. When we got home, the boys were happy and fed, and Jess had cleaned up the kitchen without being asked. She took her payment and left at the agreed time without trying to linger or chat. It felt like watching her grow into a healthier version of herself, right in front of us. My wife and I went to our next therapy session with Ingrid and talked about the guilt we still felt about not recognizing Jess's attachment issues sooner. I kept circling back to all the ways I had enabled her unhealthy behavior and how much time we had wasted before getting her real help. Ingrid listened and then reminded us that we had acted from a place of compassion, even if our methods were wrong. She said the important thing was that we did the hard work of correcting our approach once we understood the problem. She told us we needed to give ourselves permission to forgive our mistakes because holding on to guilt wasn't helping anyone. My wife reached over and held my hand during that conversation. Ingrid pointed out that our marriage was stronger now because we had learned to communicate honestly about difficult things instead of avoiding conflict. The permission to let go of some of the guilt felt like lifting a heavy backpack off my shoulders. 3 weeks later, my phone rang while I was making dinner, and I saw Jess's name on the screen. My stomach tightened immediately because she almost never called me directly anymore. I answered and heard panic in her voice. She told me her father had contacted her out of nowhere saying he wanted to meet up and reconnect after all these years. She was crying and asking me what she should do and whether she should give him a chance or tell him to leave her alone. Every instinct in my body wanted to give her advice and tell her exactly how to handle the situation. Instead, I took a breath and asked her what she was feeling about it. She talked for a few minutes about being angry and confused and also curious about why he left. I listened and then told her this was something she should discuss with her therapist and her caseworker because they could help her think through her feelings better than I could. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, and thanked me for listening. After we hung up, I realized that setting that boundary and not trying to solve her problem for her felt like real growth on my part. 3 months into the new normal, my wife and I were folding laundry together one evening after the kids went to bed. She stopped folding and looked at me and said she wanted to tell me something. She said she could see how much I had changed in how I handled situations with the twins and their friends. I was asking her opinion more before making decisions and setting clearer expectations about behavior and boundaries. She said I wasn't trying to be everyone's best friend anymore at the expense of actually being a parent. The compliment hit me harder than I expected, and I felt my eyes get watery. Earning back her trust had been my main focus for months, and hearing her acknowledge the changes meant everything to me. We finished the laundry and went to bed early and talked about our marriage and how we wanted to keep working on our communication, even now that the crisis with Jess had calmed down. Tina came and found me in the garage one Sunday while I was organizing some old sports equipment. She sat down on a cooler and told me she wanted to talk about Jess. My heart sank because I thought maybe something had gone wrong with their friendship. Instead, Tina told me that things with Jess were actually really good now. They were still close, but it felt different and healthier. Jess had other friend groups and activities and wasn't dependent on Tina for all her social needs. Tina said she was actually glad everything had happened because their friendship felt real now, instead of being based on Jess desperately needing something from our family. She told me Jess seemed happier and more confident and less anxious all the time. I asked Tina if she felt like she had lost her friend during all the changes, and she shook her head. She said she felt like she had gained a real friend instead of someone who needed to be rescued. The silver lining in all the pain and difficulty was that both girls had learned something valuable about healthy relationships. A few days later, Holden called to tell me Jess had decided to meet her father with support from her therapist and his supervision. He said the meeting was scheduled for the following week at a neutral location with Holden present the whole time. Jess's father, Jack, had been sober for 2 years and was genuinely trying to make amends for abandoning his family. Holden said he had done background checks and talked to Jack's sponsor, and everything seemed legitimate. I felt that old protective instinct flare up and wanted to ask a million questions about whether this was safe for Jess. Instead, I thanked Holden for the update and told him I trusted his judgment about the situation. After we hung up, I sat with the uncomfortable feeling of not being in control of what happened to Jess. I reminded myself that she had a whole team of trained professionals supporting her through this, and my job was to step back and let them do their work. Thanksgiving arrived, and our family gathered around the table with a sense of gratitude that felt earned instead of automatic. The crisis with Jess had revealed problems in our marriage that we needed to address and taught our kids important lessons about the difference between helping and enabling. Jess was getting the real support she desperately needed from people who were qualified to provide it. My wife and I were communicating better and being more honest with each other about our feelings and concerns. Tina had learned about healthy boundaries in friendships, and the twins had watched us work through a difficult situation without pretending everything was perfect. We weren't a perfect family, but we were stronger and more honest than we had been 8 months ago when this whole thing started. I looked around the table at my wife and kids and felt grateful for the hard conversations and difficult choices that had brought us to this point. A few days after Thanksgiving, a card arrived in the mail addressed to me. The envelope had Jess's handwriting on it, neat and careful like she'd taken her time. I opened it at the kitchen table while my wife made coffee. Inside was a simple thank you card with a handwritten note that filled the entire inside panel. She wrote that this year she was actually grateful for her life for the first time she could remember. She listed everything that had changed. Her new therapist who helped her understand her feelings, her caseworker who checked in every week, her mentor who was teaching her about college applications, her mom's sobriety, which had lasted 4 months now, her improving grades because she could focus on the school instead of survival, the chance to know her dad again, even though it was scary and awkward. At the bottom, she signed it, "Your friend Jess," instead of anything else. I stared at that signature for a long time. The boundary in those words, the appropriate distance, made something tight in my chest finally relax. I showed the card to my wife and she smiled, actually smiled, for the first time in months when Jess's name came up. The following Tuesday, we had our regular therapy session with Ingrid. My wife and I sat on the familiar couch in her office and waited for Ingrid to start like we'd done every week for the past 3 months. Instead, Ingrid closed her notebook and looked at us with a satisfied expression. She told us we'd done the work and didn't need to come weekly anymore. The words took a moment to register. She explained that we'd developed strong communication tools and healthy boundaries that we could maintain on our own now. She suggested monthly check-ins to make sure we stayed on track, but said the crisis phase was over. My wife reached for my hand and squeezed it. We'd been so focused on surviving each week that I hadn't noticed we'd actually gotten better. Ingrid smiled and said most couples never do the hard work we'd done, that most people avoid these conversations until their marriages fall apart. She said we should be proud of choosing to face our problems instead of pretending they didn't exist. After we left her office, my wife suggested we celebrate with an actual date night, just the two of us. No kids, no crisis management, no heavy conversations about what went wrong. We dropped the kids at my brother's house and went to the Italian restaurant where we'd had our first date 20 years ago. We talked about normal things like movies we wanted to see and places we wanted to travel. We laughed about something stupid one of the twins said. We held hands across the table. It felt like reconnecting as a couple instead of just being crisis management partners. The next morning, my phone rang while I was getting ready for work. The caller ID showed the high school's main number. My stomach dropped because calls from the school were never good news. The principal introduced herself and asked if I had a few minutes to talk. She told me that Jess had nominated me for a Community Appreciation Award for helping connect her with support services. The recognition made me uncomfortable immediately. I started to say I didn't deserve any award because I'd made so many mistakes. The principal interrupted me gently. She said the important thing wasn't that I'd been perfect. It was that I'd ultimately done the right thing even when it was hard. She said too many adults see kids struggling and look the other way because getting involved is complicated and messy. She said I'd chosen to get involved and then chosen to get the right kind of help when I realized I was in over my head. She said that combination of caring and wisdom was exactly what the award was meant to recognize. I accepted the acknowledgement with as much grace as I could manage, thanking her for the call. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed feeling strange. I didn't feel like someone who deserved recognition. I felt like someone who'd stumbled through a crisis, making mistake after mistake until professionals fixed what I'd broken. Over the following weeks, Jess maintained steady progress that Randolph reported to me during brief check-ins. Her grades had improved significantly now that she had stable housing and emotional support. She was pulling B's in most classes and even an A in English. Randolph told me she was talking about applying to state universities and working with her mentor on college prep activities. She'd taken the SAT and scored better than expected. She was researching financial aid and scholarship opportunities. The transformation from the desperate girl who'd shown up at our door 8 months ago was remarkable. She walked differently now, with her shoulders back instead of hunched forward. She made eye contact when she talked. She had friends besides Tina, a whole group of girls she ate lunch with. Randolph said she'd even joined the debate team and was surprisingly good at it. Her confidence had grown as her circumstances stabilized. She was becoming the person she might have been all along if she'd had proper support from the beginning. Laura reached out to me through a text message one afternoon, asking if we could meet for coffee. I was hesitant at first, worried about what she might want or say, but something about the message felt different, more grounded than our previous interactions. We met at a coffee shop near the high school. Laura looked healthier than the last time I'd seen her. Her eyes were clearer. She'd gained some weight in a good way, filling out the hollow places in her face. She told me she was 6 months sober and had completed her parenting program through the county services. She and Jess were attending family counseling together to repair their relationship. She said Victor was permanently out of the picture, that she'd gotten a restraining order and changed the locks. She was focused on being the mother Jess deserved instead of the mother she'd been. Her accountability surprised me. She didn't make excuses or blame anyone else. She owned her failures and talked about her progress with genuine pride. She thanked me for making the CPS report, even though it had been terrifying at the time. She said it had forced her to face problems she'd been avoiding for years. Her follow-through and commitment gave me genuine hope that Jess's home situation might actually stay stable this time. My wife and I decided to host a holiday party in mid-December, something we hadn't done in years. We invited neighbors, friends from work, parents from the kids' schools. Tina asked if she could invite a few friends, including Jess. We agreed without the anxiety that would have consumed us months earlier. The night of the party, Jess arrived with Tina and 2 other girls from the school. She wore a nice sweater and jeans that actually fit her properly. She said hello to me and my wife politely, gave us both quick, appropriate hugs, then moved into the crowd of guests. I watched her throughout the evening. She mingled naturally with other people, laughing at someone's story, helping my wife carry appetizers from the kitchen without being asked, chatting comfortably with one of our neighbors about her college plans. She left at a reasonable time with the other girls, thanking us for having her as she walked out the door. The normalcy of her presence felt like the best possible outcome. She was just one of several teenagers at the party instead of the center of attention or the source of family crisis. She belonged without consuming everything around her. Holden called me one evening to update me on Jess's progress with her father. Jack had started having regular supervised visits with Jess and was proving himself reliable in ways that surprised everyone. He showed up consistently for every scheduled visit. He followed through on small commitments like bringing her favorite snacks or remembering details she'd mentioned in previous conversations. He was attending his own therapy to work through the guilt of abandoning his family. Holden said that having her father back in her life in a healthy way was helping Jess understand what appropriate adult relationships should look like. She was learning that people could be dependable, that men could be trustworthy, that parents could show up consistently without chaos or drama. The expanded support network was giving her what one family never could have provided. She had her mother working on sobriety, her father rebuilding trust, her therapist helping her process trauma, her caseworker coordinating services, her mentor guiding her toward college and our family as appropriate friends instead of substitute parents. The village that was supposed to raise a child was actually coming together for Jess in a way that felt sustainable. 4 months after the original boundary conversation, Tina found me in the garage organizing tools one Saturday afternoon. She sat down on an overturned bucket and said she wanted to talk about Jess. I braced myself for bad news. Instead, Tina told me she was glad I'd called CPS, even though it had been scary at the time. She said Jess was like a different person now, happier and more confident and less desperate for approval. She said their friendship was better because it wasn't based on Jess needing to be rescued or feeling like she owed Tina something. They could just be normal friends who liked each other instead of one person desperately clinging to the other. Tina said she'd learned important things about boundaries and helping people the right way. She said watching me struggle through all the mistakes and then fix them had taught her more about being an adult than any lecture could have. My daughter's perspective helped me forgive myself for the mistakes I'd made along the way. If Tina could see the value in what we'd been through, maybe it hadn't all been a disaster. The following week, the twins came running into the kitchen asking if Jess could take them to the park. I looked at my wife, who raised her eyebrows in question. We'd been careful about Jess spending time with the boys without supervision, worried about maintaining appropriate boundaries. But 4 months of steady progress and healthy behavior had earned some trust. I told the boys to ask Jess to check with me first. Jess came to the kitchen door looking uncertain. She asked if it would be okay to walk the twins to the park for an hour while my wife and I finished some work around the house. I agreed after confirming my wife was comfortable with it. I watched through the front window as Jess walked down the street with my sons on either side of her. They were laughing about something, probably one of the twins' terrible jokes. At the park, I could see them playing on the equipment, Jess pushing one twin on the swing while the other climbed the jungle gym. She looked like a normal teenager having fun with younger kids, rather than someone desperately seeking approval and family. The shift in her energy and confidence was visible proof that proper intervention works better than well-meaning but misguided enabling. She was free to just be a teenager instead of carrying the weight of adult problems and unhealthy attachments. Randolph called me at work one afternoon with what he called a final update. Jess was graduating from intensive counseling to monthly check-ins because she'd developed strong coping skills and healthy relationships. Her therapist felt confident that Jess had the tools she needed to handle normal teenage stress without falling back into crisis patterns. She had a solid support team now, including her therapist for monthly maintenance, her caseworker who would monitor until she turned 18, her mentor who was committed to seeing her through college applications, her improving relationship with her mother who'd maintained sobriety, and her reconnection with her father who was proving reliable. Randolph said the professional network I'd been afraid to access at first had given her what she truly needed. He thanked me again for making that initial call to CPS, even though it had felt like a betrayal. He said early intervention had prevented Jess's situation from deteriorating into something much worse, She could have ended up in foster care or on the streets, or worse. Instead, she was thriving and planning for college and building a real future. The system I'd been so scared of had actually worked exactly the way it was supposed to work. I went to my next therapy appointment with my wife feeling lighter than I had in months. Ingrid greeted us at the door with her usual warm smile and led us back to her office where we'd spent so many difficult hours working through everything. She asked how we were doing, and my wife reached over and took my hand before answering. We talked about how the past few months had changed us in ways we never expected. I told Ingrid about how I'd learned to actually communicate instead of just avoiding conflict and hoping problems would fix themselves. My wife talked about how she felt heard now in a way she hadn't for years, how we made decisions together instead of me just doing what I thought was kind without considering the bigger picture. Ingrid nodded and made notes, but mostly she just listened as we went through all the ways we'd grown. She pointed out that the crisis with Jess had forced us to confront patterns we'd been ignoring for most of our marriage. I was so busy trying not to be like my cold parents that I'd swung too far the other way and become someone who couldn't set any boundaries at all. My wife had been carrying resentment about that for years, but never knew how to bring it up without sounding mean. The whole situation had ripped everything open, but in doing that, it gave us a chance to actually fix what was broken. Ingrid said she was proud of how we'd done the work, and that most couples would have just blamed each other and fallen apart. We scheduled our next monthly check-in and left, feeling like we'd actually survived something that could have destroyed us. One Saturday morning, a few weeks later, I was in the garage organizing tools when I heard the doorbell. My wife called out that she'd get it, and I kept working on sorting through the mess I'd been ignoring for months. Then I heard my wife call my name in a tone that made me drop what I was holding and head inside. Jess was standing in our living room holding a large envelope and practically bouncing on her feet. My wife was smiling at her in a way I hadn't seen in a long time, genuine and warm without any of the tension that used to be there. Jess turned to me and held up the envelope like it was made of gold. She'd been accepted to the state university about an hour away with a partial scholarship that would cover most of her tuition. Her face was bright red, and she was talking so fast I could barely understand her, but the joy was obvious. She thanked us for being part of her support system and said she couldn't have done any of this without all the help she'd gotten. My wife hugged her and congratulated her, and I did the same. The hug felt different from the desperate ones from months ago. This was appropriate and brief and happy instead of clingy and needy. Jess talked about her plans for majoring in social work because she wanted to help other kids who were going through what she'd been through. She stayed for maybe 20 minutes telling us about the campus and the programs and her excitement about starting fresh somewhere new. When she left, she hugged both of us again and thanked us one more time. I watched her walk down the driveway to her mom's car where Laura was waiting with a proud smile on her face. My wife squeezed my arm and said that this was what healthy looked like. I realized she was right. The relationship had changed into something that could actually last because it wasn't based on Jess needing us to rescue her anymore. 6 months had passed since that terrible conversation where I'd had to set boundaries with Jess, and our family had found a rhythm that felt honest. Jess was doing well with her therapist and caseworker and mentor and the whole network of support that had been put in place. My marriage was stronger than it had been in years because my wife and I had learned to actually talk to each other about hard things instead of letting resentment build. Tina had learned important lessons about friendship and boundaries and what it meant to help someone without losing yourself in the process. The twins were doing fine and had mostly forgotten about the drama that had consumed our house for those intense weeks. I'd changed too in ways I was still discovering. I wasn't the conflict-avoidant guy who would rather enable someone than have a difficult conversation anymore. I understood now that real help sometimes meant making hard choices that felt terrible in the moment, but were necessary for everyone's long-term health. The guilt I'd carried about calling CPS and enforcing boundaries had slowly faded into acceptance that I'd done my best with a situation I wasn't equipped to handle alone. Jess was thriving in ways she never could have if I'd kept trying to be her substitute parent. Our family was healthier because we'd been forced to confront problems we'd been avoiding. Everything had worked out not because I'd been some hero who saved a broken girl, but because I'd finally admitted I needed help and trusted the systems designed for these situations. Looking back on everything, I could see how my fear of being like my cold, distant parents had almost made me fail Jess in a completely different way. I'd tried to rescue her by making her part of our family, instead of connecting her with the professional help she actually needed. She didn't need another parent who would let her avoid dealing with her real problems. She needed adults who would make sure she got proper therapy and case management and all the support that could give her real tools for building a healthy life. Our family could be part of her world without being her entire world, and that boundary had freed everyone to build relationships that were genuine instead of desperate. Jess had a whole team of people helping her now, including her mom, who was maintaining sobriety, and her dad, who was proving reliable, and her mentor and therapist and caseworker. She had friends at the school and plans for college and actual hope for her future. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is admit you're not equipped to fix everything yourself and trust that other people know what they're doing. I'd been so scared of the system because I didn't understand it, but the system had worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Jess was going to be okay, not because I'd tried to save her, but because I'd gotten out of the way and let the right people do their jobs. Well, there's your daily dose of poor life choices, narrated in high definition. If you're still here, either you're bored or you actually like me, and I'm not sure which is worse. Subscribe so we can question your decisions again tomorrow.